Best mid-game recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. What better place to start than pure ingots? Because as we can see, when we enter the refinery settings, there is a tab called Ingots. Here you can find pure iron ingots, pure copper ingots, and pure deuterium ingots. For these recipes, essentially all they do is combine iron ore and water to make your ingots themselves. But why is this such a big deal? Well, to answer that question, we need to head back over to our smelter, where to make 75 iron ingots, we need 75 iron ore. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Yet in the refinery, again, if we want to make our 75 iron ingots, now it only requires roughly 41 iron ore and 23 water per minute, rather than 75 iron ingots. So essentially with these three recipes right here, you get to save a ton of iron, copper, and deuterium. Some ores, of course, being more important than others, which is fantastic. Additionally, in the refinery, you could actually make 162.5 iron ingots per minute, compared to the 75 per minute you can make in the smelter. But there are some negatives to this. Of course, this is a refinery. It requires 30 megawatts of power per minute, whereas a smelter requires 4. And obviously, if you have another quick look at this recipe here, this recipe also involves water, which means you have to get water logistics involved. However, I think these three recipes, the pure ingots, are extremely fantastic and satisfactory if power is not a concern to you. And of course, if you're mass producing these items as well, preferably next to the coast, we've got a ton of water and of course a ton of iron. So this is a fantastic set of recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. However, this is not the only recipe we'll be covering today. We'll also be talking about computers, crystal oscillators, circuit boards, refinery alternates, which we'll talk about in just a moment, rocket fuel, diluted fuel, but first I want to talk a bit more about heavy modular frames. The recipe we'll be using today is the heavy encased frame alt. If you have a very quick look here at the regular heavy modular frame recipe, we need 25 modular frames, 100 steel pipes, 25 encased industrial beam, and the thing I hate the most, 600 screws per minute. Now, let's take a very quick glance at this other recipe, the alternate heavy encased frame. We need 13.34 modular frames, which is less, a lot less, than our first recipe. We also need 60 steel pipes, which is a lot less than our first recipe. We also need 16.7 encased industrial beams, which is a lot less than our first recipe. And rather than using 600 screws, now we just need 36.7 concrete. So not only do you save in every single item here, but you also no longer have to use 600 screws, you just have to use a little bit of concrete. And as one can expect, when it comes to the actual recipe requirements themselves, look at this. You use only 495 iron compared to 817 iron from the basic recipe, 182 limestone compared to 825. And that isn't bad maths on my part, because here you need 60 concrete, 90 concrete, and 125 concrete. And of course here we're not using any special recipes, so that ends up requiring 825 limestone. And of course you're also going to need 167 coal per minute, whereas the recipe I've just shown you requires 0 coal per minute. Instead you just need 434 water. Which sounds like a lot, but it's only a few water extractors, so that's not even a drastic amount at all. Heavy encased frame recipe is the best heavy modular frame recipe in literally every single way possible. But this is not the only case where something like this occurs. And we'll find that out in just a little bit. But now I want to try and talk about something called refinery alternates, and this is extremely important to understand for the rest of these recipes. And our three refinery alternates are concrete, quartz crystals, and copper sheets. But what makes these three items so special compared to everything else? Well, let's have a very quick gander in our constructor, where we can make 30 concrete from 90 limestone, whereas 30 concrete in the refinery only requires 45 limestone and of course a little bit of water, just like our pure ingots. That is what makes these three items so special. Because you can make wet concrete, you can also make your crystals in here as well, the pure quartz crystals, and your steamed copper sheets, all in the refinery when you combine them with water. Obviously meaning you need less copper ingots. So let's take copper sheets as an example, because this is incredible. So on the left, we have our typical copper sheet recipe. To make 20 copper sheets, we need 40 copper ingots, and to make our 40 copper ingots, we then need 40 copper ore. Whereas, if we were to use our refinery recipes, including the pure copper ingot I just showed you earlier on in today's video, we can see that to make our 20 copper sheets, we need 20 copper ingots and 20 water. Then to make our ingots, we then need 8 copper ore and 5.4 water. So, as we can see here, 40 copper ore compared to just 8. This might not sound like a massive difference, but bear in mind, if you are making, let's say, 1,000 of these things, you'll be saving hundreds and hundreds of copper ore, which you can then use for something else. Fortunately, yes, the second recipe does consume more power and does consume water, but if you're fine with that, then this is a brilliant recipe. But what are you going to do with all that remaining copper? Well, how about you turn it into uranium? And I know that sounds like a joke, but actually it's not, because of the converter. Here in the converter, you can make uranium from bauxite, but that's not copper. Well, yes, that's because when you actually go to bauxite itself, you can then make bauxite again in the converter from copper. So you turn your copper into bauxite and your bauxite into uranium. The refinery also just another fantastic way to get a bunch of resources with very little ore. But wait, in theory, there's one more. Yes, that is called the coated cable. But the reason as to why I don't talk about this is because it requires heavy oil residue. It doesn't require water and it doesn't require, let's say, copper. Unfortunately, it's not the greatest recipe in the world, unless you've got a good amount of heavy oil residue saved up and a good amount of wire, but I wouldn't normally recommend making this. If I was you, just stick to these 3 recipes because they're very, very simple to make. Now let's talk about one of the best fan favorite recipes in Satisfactory 1.0, which is diluted fuel. But why is this a fan favorite? Well, here's the reason as to why. Because if we want to use diluted fuel, this is the recipe that we need. To create 100 fuel per minute, we need 150 heavy oil residue. And then to make 150 heavy oil residue with a byproduct of 75 polymer resin, we then need 112.5 crude oil. This is with 0 alternate recipes, and as you can see, 112 crude oil making 100 fuel isn't a very good ratio whatsoever. If only there was a way to make this slightly better. Introducing diluted fuel. And again, we're making 100 fuel per minute, but this time, we are combining it with water, a bottle of water, and of course our heavy oil residue here as well. But this time, we only need 37.5 crude oil per minute, not 112.5, no, 37.5. So you end up saving an absolute ton of crude oil, which is amazing. Not to mention you also get a bit of polymer resin, but that's not too important. So this is fantastic as well. Something else that's fantastic about diluted fuel here as well is that it actually requires less power than our basic recipe. So not only do you save essentially 2/3 of your crude oil, but you also save power as well, meaning that you can get a lot more power out of your crude oil and again save power in the process. I mean, if you are interested in saving power and of course getting more fuel, this is the recipe you should be using. I 1000% recommend this, and it's one of my favorite recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 and in Satisfactory in general, and there's a reason as to why everyone likes it. Now we are going to see how diluted fuel plays a part in our rocket fuel best recipe, and this recipe might confuse a few people. Here's the reason why. This is the basic recipe. It's the recipe I use, and it's the recipe that I thought was the best one, where to create your 100 rocket fuel per minute, you need 10 nitric acid, which involves nitrogen gas, iron, and water, and that's basically it. And you also need turbo fuel, where, as you'll notice over here, we've used our diluted fuel recipe, which saved us on a bunch of crude oil, which is amazing. We also need something called compact coal. Now, one of the best things about this recipe is that when you make your rocket fuel, you get 10 compact coal as a byproduct. So what you could do is actually recycle it back into the main cycle itself, then save on coal and sulfur. I always assumed that this was the best recipe for making rocket fuel. It's the recipe I've used, and I was fairly happy with it. Until I did this. This is the alt recipe, where the only thing you need, again, is fuel, which, again, we are using our diluted fuel recipe, nitrogen gas, sulfur, and coal. That's it. all of it just goes straight into a blender. And because of how simple logistically this recipe is to make, as long as you've got your fuel being made, everything else just goes straight into the blender. Because of this, again, you end up saving on quite a lot of power, but it's not necessarily all positives. As you can see, our compact coal, despite us making more of it, doesn't actually go back into this recipe, because we're not using compact coal. We're still using the same ingredients as compact coal, but we just need our basic sulfur and our coal. So that's a bit of a shame, but of course you can always use this for other things here as well. When it comes to the actual recipe itself, for the first recipe you end up saving on sulfur and nitrogen gas just about, but for our second recipe, you save on coal, water, crude oil, iron. Not only that, but it's also fantastic for power consumption, and logistically, it is an absolute piss take to try and make. I definitely would recommend making this rocket fuel recipe, because you're only consuming a little bit more nitrogen gas in all honesty, and you save so much time logistically, it's actually unreal. So in my opinion, this is the best rocket fuel recipe in Satisfactory 1.0, especially for the mid-game progress. In a moment, we'll be talking a bit about computers, but to understand why I chose the computer recipe I did, we have to look a little bit more into circuit boards and crystal oscillators. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's start with circuit boards. For the basic recipe, we'll be making 10 circuit boards per minute, which of course I'll be making for the alt recipe as well. And to make our 10 circuit boards, we are going to need 20 copper sheets, or 40 copper ore, and 40 plastic per minute as well. This, in my opinion, is the best way of making plastic. It does take the most amount of time, but honestly, I think it's entirely worth it, because you end up saving a ton of crude oil, but you do need a little bit of fuel as well, which luckily you can make as a byproduct from the heavy oil residue, which is fantastic. When it comes to resources required, you need 40 copper ore, 30 crude oil, and 20 water per minute. And when it comes to the power requirements, you need a blender, water extractor, assembler, smelter, refinery, and a constructor. So in total, you have to consume 103 megawatts worth of power just to make your 10 circuit boards. But let's say, for example, you don't want to use crude oil, you want to save on resources, and you don't necessarily want to use over 100 megawatts worth of power. Well, I've got the recipe just for you. That is called silicon circuit boards, where despite me just making the basic copper sheet recipe to save on simplicity, this only requires copper and raw quartz. That's it. As simple as that. And of course, again, you can get your steamed copper sheets involved and your pure copper ingots, where you then only have to consume like 5.4 water and 8 copper ore, which is fantastic. And because of that, you only consume 29 megawatts worth of power, as well as 13.2 raw quartz and 40 copper ore. I think this is the best circuit board recipe in Satisfactory. I love it. It doesn't get crude oil involved, which I love, and overall, I just really enjoy it. If you really wanted to, there is a recipe out there that just involves crude oil and water. That's called electrode circuit boards, because you need petroleum coke, which is made from crude oil, and rubber, which is made from crude oil. So you can always use this recipe if you want, if you just want to involve crude oil and water in your circuit board build. Next up, we've got our crystal oscillator. And in this recipe, we'll be combining everything we've learnt so far from today's video to form in which, in my opinion, I'd call a pretty good recipe. And we are making 5 crystal oscillators per minute here. So we need reinforced iron plates, quartz crystals, and cable to make our basic crystal oscillator. And again, we're using the basic reinforced iron plates, basic quartz crystals, and basic cable recipes here. Everything about this is completely basic. And because of that, we are consuming 150 iron ore, 150 raw quartz, and 70 copper ore. And that might sound okay, because again, 5 crystal oscillators per minute is a pretty decent amount. But what if I told you there was a way to cut back on everything here? And it's very simple. Well, all you have to do is follow the crystal oscillator basic recipe with alternates. When it comes to our reinforced iron plates, we are using iron plates and iron wire. And when it comes to our cable, again, we are also using iron wire, meaning that in total we need 188 iron ingots. But let's talk a bit about those pure ingots that I was mentioning earlier. If you were to use that in here, you then save a bit of iron, but you do have to use a little bit of water, which I think is a pretty decent compromise. Then when we talk about our quartz crystal recipe, again, we're using that pure quartz crystal recipe that I showed you in the refinery a bit earlier on. You end up saving raw quartz, but using a bit of extra water. What is the one item that we are not consuming here that we consumed a bit earlier on? That is copper, because we're using iron wire. But you'll think, okay, well, you're using 78 extra iron, so of course you'll then be consuming more iron for this recipe. Well, the answer is actually no. Instead, we are consuming 102 iron ore, 116 raw quartz, and 123 water per minute, which when we compare it to our first recipe, is less iron, less raw quartz, and 0 copper ore. Instead, we just consume a little bit of water. So this recipe really does show you what can happen when you use those pure ingots and other refinery alternate recipes to form the perfect recipe for crystal oscillators. You bear in mind though that the power consumption for this is most likely a bit higher than our basic recipe, but if you're okay with that, and of course okay with using water, then that is a fantastic crystal oscillator recipe for you to use. Moving on now though, we've got the final recipe of the video. That is right, it's computers. First of all, let's talk about the basic recipe, where to make our 5 computers per minute, we need 80 plastic, 40 cable, and 20 circuit boards. Now, to be fair, we are using our better circuit board recipe here, which is the one I do recommend, but of course we're using it without those steamed copper sheets and pure copper ingots. When it comes to our cable, again, we're just using the basic copper recipe there for our wire, but when it comes to our 80 plastic per minute, we are consuming 60 crude oil per minute, which I think is an absolutely ridiculous amount to make 80 plastic per minute. However, it is needed there to make that 20 heavy oil residue byproduct, to then make our fuel, to then make our plastic. But again, if you don't want to use crude oil, and if you don't want to use this much copper, then you might prefer this recipe over here, which might look a bit more complicated, and I suppose in some parts it is. When we break it down, it's actually a lot easier. So firstly, our circuit boards, where in reality we're only consuming roughly 20 water per minute or 21 water per minute, 10 raw quartz per minute, and 6.6 copper ore to make our 7.5 circuit boards, which really is a very good amount of resources to make all this. And when it comes to our crystal oscillators, the only real steep thing here is our 45 quartz crystals, which ends up consuming 60 raw quartz, which I'm not necessarily thrilled about, but it is what it is. And then when it comes to our reinforced iron plates and our cable, we can combine all of the iron ingots together, meaning we only consume 52 iron ore and 30 water. Now when it comes to the actual recipe itself, we can see here that things don't necessarily look too good for our alternate recipe, because our basic recipe consumes less iron, less water, and less raw quartz, and also some other stuff here as well, which isn't too important. But when we talk a bit about iron, it's one of the, if anything, it's actually the easiest ore to come by, so that is kind of irrelevant. Water, you can find it absolutely everywhere, so again, that's kind of irrelevant. The only heavy hitter here is the raw quartz. What I want to pay attention to is the first 2 categories here. We go from 60 crude oil per minute to 0. And then we go from 128 copper to 6.6. This difference, for me at least, is well worth consuming a little bit more water, iron, and raw quartz. But again, that is entirely up to you, but in my opinion, I definitely feel like this is better. You probably again end up consuming more power here, but the amount of crude oil that you save, I think is entirely worth it. And of course, the reason why I like saving crude oil is so I can produce more power from it, so that's great. Those are my favourite mid-game recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Of course, I did do a video where I talked about the best basic recipes and early game recipes in Satisfactory 1.0, so if you want to see that, then make sure to check the video that's currently on screen right now. But if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to drop a like, all support is greatly appreciated. But without further ado, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, a massive thank you to our channel members, The Bearded Cobra, Jao, Variants, Nicole Still Plays, Asuna, Natormal, Yummy Kill Burns, Chaos Rising, Scott and Hattie, and Mau Mau. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.